All right. Hi, guys. Today we are going to extend what you guys learned yesterday. So yesterday, or in the last video, you guys learned about Mendelian genetics and the basics of genetics. So Mendel worked with a really simple system. Peas are genetically simple. So what that means is most of their traits, so the color of their flowers, the shape of their pea pods, the color of the actual peas themselves, are only controlled by a single gene, and each gene has only two versions, or there's only two alleles, either a completely dominant allele or a recessive allele. But usually in most things, it's not that simple. So there are other types of genetics. There's times when things are incompletely dominant or codominant or polygenic, which means it's controlled by multiple genes. There's even genes that are impacted by the environment around you, and we call that epigenetics. And then there are also sex-linked traits. Due to timing reasons, we will be focusing just on sex-linked traits because it goes really well with the genetic disorders that we'll be looking at later on. So, as a reminder, men and women are very different, but there's really only a few genes that create that difference. So in mammals, there are two sex chromosomes, the X and the Y, and that is what kind of determines whether you're male or female. Males will have an X and a Y. Females will have two X's. So these two X's will have the same genes, but the X and the Y will not. So when we take a look at a karyotype, we have to remember that the first 22 pairs of chromosomes are called autosomes. So those are the ones that do not determine gender. The last pair are the sex chromosomes. So if you inherit two X's, you are a female. If you inherit an X and a Y, you are a male. Now, why does that matter? What's the difference between them? The Y chromosome has very few genes. It does not contain the same genes as the X chromosome. So in this case, we don't actually have alleles. We have the genes on the X chromosome and the genes on the Y chromosome. The X chromosome contains many genes that can affect many different traits. So when we talk about sex-linked genes, we're looking at genes that are on each one of these chromosomes separately. Now, some genes are only present on one of the sex chromosomes. For example, the gene for seeing color and the gene for baldness are all on the X chromosome. So females, because they inherit two X chromosomes, even if they get an allele for, let's say, color blindness, which is recessive, if they only get one of those and their other X it has a dominant trait, they're going to show that dominant phenotype. They will still be able to see color. However, the problem is with males, since they only have one X, if they inherit an X with a recessive trait, they will automatically show that, which is why things like color blindness shows up a lot more in males than females, because females can only get it a third of the time. Males have about a 50% chance of that. And that's why we have something called male pattern baldness. It is because it typically shows up more in males than females. Females can get it, but it's a lot rarer. So when we look at these X-linked genes, those are the ones that are specifically on the X chromosome. Females will inherit the gene like we do normally, like you learned yesterday. The normal principle of dominance applies. If you have at least one dominant allele, you will show the dominant phenotype. If you have two recessive, you will show the recessive phenotype. However, males inherit the gene on that X, but not on the Y. So because males only have one X, they are going to express whatever trait is on that X, whether it is dominant or recessive. So when we take a look at an example here, instead of having something that looks like this, where you would have this would be an autosomal cross, you will actually have to show whether these things are male or female, so we can keep track of whether they're inheriting two X's or an X and a Y. So if we take a look at this male, they have an X and a Y. When we create gametes through meiosis, this male can either give an X to his sperm or a Y to his sperm. Whatever gene is on that X will be passed to his offspring. Whatever genes are on the Y will be passed to his offspring. Same thing with the female. She gets 2 X's. So the female will always give an X to their offspring, but the alleles on that X can be different. This mother is what we call a carrier. So carriers are people that have the allele for a recessive trait, but they don't actually show it. So when you go through and cross these two things, you will see that obviously 50% of the time you'll get males, 50% of the time you'll get females. Our females will still not show this recessive trait, but 50% of our males will show this recessive trait because they inherited it from their mom. They had to get that X from their mom. So they have to show that recessive trait. So that's the basics with X-linked. That will come into play a lot more importantly when we get into genetic disorders, but it's good that you understand it right now. All right, guys, if you have any questions, please feel free